Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In this, our final installment in the discussion of colonial America, we're going to talk about the conflict that in many ways sets the stage for the American Revolution. It certainly creates many of the conditions that are going to lead us into the American Revolution, and that is the French and Indian War. In the previous lecture, we talked about some of the early skirmishes of the French and Indian War and how essentially things were not going very well for the British. The first couple of years of the war involved victories for the French and actually pretty serious losses for the British. But in 1757, England got a new prime minister whose name was William Pitt. And Pitt decided to devote the bulk of his energies to fighting the war in North America. Now remember, this is part of a broader conflict between the European powers. So he's going to concentrate actually on North America. He sent far and away the largest fighting force the colonies had ever seen, 23,000 soldiers and 14,000 sailors. By sheer force of numbers, the British began to pile up victories. In 1758 and 59, they began to capture the string of French forts. As momentum swung in England's favor, the Iroquois Confederacy joined their side and assisted in even more victories. And we're going to be talking about this a little bit more in future lectures, how the Indians often will try to align themselves with whichever power they perceive is winning. In 1760, the British took Martinique, which was one of France's richest colonies, a sugar island, and Montreal, the key French city in North America. And at that point, really, it was only a matter of time before the French surrendered. The Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ended the French and Indian War, radically changed the balance of power in North America. France, having been defeated in the war, was greatly depleted, left with only some minor colonies in parts of Canada and the Caribbean. Spain, which had joined the British side very late in the war, obtained New Orleans and the vast territory west of the Mississippi. We will be talking about the fate of this kind of Spanish Empire in future lectures. The British, in the aftermath of this war, obtained Florida. There's another important element of this treaty. It actually comes about after the treaty itself, but it's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And as you can see on this map, it essentially runs down the spine of what is today the Appalachian Mountains. With this line, the British government tried to set up a peaceful boundary between the British settlers and the Indians. So again, roughly corresponding with the crest line of the Appalachian Mountains, leaving the lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River to the Indians, and the lands east of that line to the colonists. And we will see shortly how that proclamation line worked out. So this map shows us the impact of the outcome of the French and Indian War by contrasting the North American situation before 1754, so before the French and Indian War, and then in 1763 after the war. And the biggest difference, of course, you see this purple splotch here, which was French-controlled territory prior to the war, and that purple splotch is essentially gone in the aftermath. It's all either British or Spanish territory. So let's talk about some of the results of the French and Indian War for some of the different groups involved. So for the Indians, the outcome of this war was devastating. They had grown skilled at playing off French traders against the British, bargaining for better rates and deals. And I described how they would sort of play the middle ground between the two sides. Now the French were essentially gone. Also, the French methods of trading had been preferable to the English. The French, as I've described, were small in number. They had a few trading posts and forts strewn throughout Indian territory. So they were not interested in killing off the Indians or taking their land. They were used to kind of giving gifts and liquor to the Indians and enjoying generally positive trading relationships. The English did not. They took a much harder line on trading with the Indians, and now that the French weren't there to kind of counterbalance things, that situation only got worse. So one response to these new methods is the growth of a pan-Indian movement, which I've mentioned briefly in previous lectures. We start to see the disparate Indian tribes starting to come together and fight against the British settlers as one. An Indian prophet named Neolin began preaching of Indian renewal, going back to traditional Indian ways and liberating themselves from the British. An Ottawa chief named Pontiac heard Neolin preach and decided to act. Pontiac organized a rebellion against the British in May of 1763. The Indians began to unite and fight as one, and for a time they were very successful, capturing 8 out of 12 British forts in the Ohio River Valley. The British government managed to overcome Pontiac's rebellion by bribing various Indian groups to leave Pontiac's coalition. So it was kind of divide and conquer. So the group ultimately fell apart and the rebellion was suppressed. But it did show that if the Indians could unify and come together, they might be more successful. So this idea of pan-Indianism is going to kind of grow after Pontiac's rebellion. What about results of the war for the colonies and for the British? Well, for a time the colonies suffered in the aftermath of this war. Many of their men were killed in the war. They didn't have a whole lot of money or resources left in the aftermath, and depression set in. In terms of some other impact in the aftermath of the war, one practical result of the war is that a number of colonial soldiers gained experience in this war that's going to serve them well in the Revolutionary War, most notably George Washington, who will of course lead the colonial efforts in the Revolutionary Army. Also, I mentioned with the Albany Conference, but we start to see colonists traveling more beyond their old traditional boundaries and starting to see a bigger picture. You start to see the colonies beginning to unify as one. From the British perspective, in the aftermath of this war and Pontiac's rebellion, they begin to understand they're going to have to do a better job protecting the frontier and sending forces to kind of monitor the situation in the colonies. So they put in place the Proclamation Line in 1763 and sent a standing army to permanently protect the colonists. However, there are also those in Great Britain arguing that the colonies themselves should pay for this protection, even if they don't want it. That the British government should not have to bear all of that burden. So Parliament decides to begin taxing the colonies to help pay for their own protection. They pass a series of acts designed to raise money to pay for the defense of the colonies. These are the notorious taxes, and the famous phrase taxation without representation kind of evolves from this. But these are the taxes that are going to ultimately build the momentum driving us toward the Revolutionary War. And that, of course, will be the topic of discussion for our next chapter.